I spent 27 years, 3 months, and 9 days in the federal government. I loved every single one of those days. I'm not complaining, but when I retired in 2008, the government was kind enough to send me a little note saying, you served 27 years, 3 months, and 9 days. And Libby and I went all around the world. We served in Mauritania, West Africa during Jimmy Carter's administration. I was an intern there. We served in Egypt, in Cairo, in the early 1980s, when Hosni Mubarak was, by the way, a really fine friend of the United States. At a time after Sadat's death, we needed someone to make peace and maintain that peace with Israel, which he did. We served in Jerusalem. We lived in a Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem. Our second daughter, our beautiful daughter Elizabeth, was born there. And we saw this incredibly compelling drama. A now 63-year struggle between the Israelis and Palestinians for land, for water, for the historic land of Palestine, for religion. And we lived in the middle of it. We lived in a Palestinian neighborhood. I worked to coordinate American aid to the Palestinians in the West Bank, so we were in the refugee camps and in Hebron and Ramallah, Nablus every day, and it was quite an experience. And Libby learned a little Hebrew because we felt it was very important that we not take sides, that we not become part of the partisan problem of that region, and that we kind of stand between them and try to help both sides. And then later on, we lived in Greece, where I was the American ambassador at a time of acute anti-Americanism. We can talk about the Greek crisis if you'd like. And then we had the great pleasure and privilege to live in Brussels, where I was ambassador to NATO. So a lot of time in Washington, but a lot of time overseas. And we have a career diplomatic corps. It's not as well known as the military, because we're so much smaller. There are about 6,500 active diplomats in the world. There are many, many more military officers and enlisted personnel. We're a small corps, but like the military, we're career, we are nonpartisan. We normally don't tell people who we vote for because it's important to be neutral in our political system. We serve both parties. We serve whoever the American people elect. I'm no longer an active duty member of that corps, but I'm still very loyal to it. Beth Jones is back, as I said. She had retired, but she's now back serving and doing really important work, which I'll talk to you in a minute. From that perspective, from my perspective, I now teach international politics and American foreign policy at Harvard. How should we look at grand strategy? What should we do in the world, and what challenges are we up against? I would start with the following statement. You may agree or disagree with it. This is the most complex array of foreign policy challenges that the United States has faced in my lifetime. I'm 56 years old. I can't remember a time when we faced so many seemingly mortal, vital, really difficult, complex issues simultaneously. And the way for me to illustrate that would be to talk a little bit about what President Obama's day is like. But before I do that, I don't want to be prone to exaggeration. When I say it's the most complex time, I'm not saying it's the most fateful time. And Colonel Wilkinson talked a little bit about history, and I really admired the way he wove history into our present reality. The most fateful time was the Revolution, when it was sink or swim. Our backs were to the wall, and we were going to create this great nation or not, and of course we did. The most dangerous time was not now. It was certainly the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, when this country was pitted against each other. Whether you think it was the war between the states or the Civil War. Libby and I were in South Hadley. I was at Mount Holyoke in September, and there's a Civil War statue to the men from South Hadley who fought for the Union. And it said it was the war of Southern rebellion against our Union. And as a Northerner, that appealed to me. But it was a war that tore us apart, and that was the most dangerous conflict we ever had. It may not even be this time. Perhaps not even the single most difficult initiative to mobilize ourselves to face a threat. That might have been the Second World War, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt mobilized 16 million people, men and women, and the women are largely forgotten in this conflict, to go into uniform and to fight a two-front war against the most powerful foes we've ever faced in a conventional sense, Imperial Japan and the Nazi Empire of Adolf Hitler. But I think it's the most complex time. And I say that because, just to kind of trace what it's like to be our president on a daily basis. So he lives in this beautiful house, and he goes down the elevator with the Secret Service detail, 2 stories down to the ground floor. He walks through the Rose Garden, created by Jacqueline Kennedy, into the West Wing, built by Theodore Roosevelt in 1908, 1909. It's the locus of power in the world. We're still the most powerful country. He is the most powerful person in the world by a long shot. And he sits at his desk, and he's got 2 proverbial inboxes. And one's called Domestic Problems, and it's a mile or 2 or 3 high. And I'm not competent to go through that inbox. Governor DuPont would be, but I've never been elected to office, and I don't work on domestic policy. The other inbox I know something about, as does Grog Johnson, as does Beth. And that's our foreign policy, national security, international challenges. What's in the inbox in 2012? The Great Recession. And lest we forget what it must have felt like for Barack Obama to take the oath of office on January 20th, 2009, and think about what he and we were facing, there was active discussion of bank nationalizations 3 years ago. The great fear among most economists in our country and around the world was not recession, but the possibility of depression. And it turned out to be the most severe economic recession, the Great Recession, in 70 years. It was worldwide. And while the economists, including some of my colleagues at the Harvard Kennedy School, who are on the committee that actually decides when we're in and not in a recession, say we're out of it, well, tell that to the millions of Americans who've lost their homes to foreclosure. Or the people who can't find jobs. And as I said this morning, because we have 3 daughters in their 20s, and they are more or less and have been gainfully employed, it's so difficult as a young 22 or 3 or 4-year-old to come out, even of our best colleges, and have the same degree of optimism that we had when we left college in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s. We were fortunate and very, very lucky in comparison. This Great Recession, it has knocked the pillar away from our economy. So the collapse of Lehman Brothers, September 16, 2008, the panic on Wall Street, the absolute loss of credibility, in my eyes, of parts of our financial system for the reasons why this crisis was created in the first place, and how difficult it's been to cope with it. This is not one person's responsibility, and I'm not trying to make a partisan statement here. But the thing about government is it's a relay race. And you've got the baton, and Condi Rice used to talk to us about this when she was Secretary of State. Our job, she said, is just run that race as best we can and hand that baton off to the next group. The baton was handed off from George W. Bush to Barack Obama. They both have some responsibility, and they both have ownership, and so do all of we. Because Washington didn't create the crisis. Lots of people created it. But think about that Great Recession, what it must feel like to be either President Obama or Speaker Boehner. This is not a partisan assessment. And to have the weight of the world on your shoulders. And to think that that might occupy a president for a full 4 years in office, of a first term in office. And then think about the fact that in addition to the Great Recession, he's had to fight and contend with 2 wars. The 2 longest wars in our history, 150,000 troops in Iraq for most of the last 8 years, now mercifully out, thankfully out. The tremendous sacrifice that our military made, over 4,400 men and women dead, over 30,000 people wounded, many of them quite severely, tens of thousands of Iraqis dead. Think of the human cost alone of that war and how difficult it's been. Not to speak of the loss of credibility, in part because of Abu Ghraib, in part because of the long-term occupation, in part because of the fact that we had occupied 2 Muslim countries and the crisis that produced in America's relationship with the Muslim world, 1 billion people, 1/7 of humanity. The Iraq War was a profound experience for this country, whether you were for it or against it. And now the Afghan War, as President Obama took office, made a very important decision. As he said, we would come out of Iraq, we will build up in Afghanistan. He added 30,000 troops. Our troop levels have been around 108,000, 109,000. Now they're going to go down by September and October of this year, but we'll still have 70,000 American troops in Afghanistan. And by the way, with no end in sight, although Beth, can speak with far greater authority than I can on this, even if we think about a transfer authority from NATO to the Afghan forces in 2014, no one's really talking specifically about bringing all American troops home in 2014, and maybe we shouldn't, given the fact that we don't want the Taliban to come back. So you've got the Great Recession, and you have the two wars, and that's just the tip of the iceberg of what the President of the United States faces on foreign policy, because behind that, you've got the two countries, Iran in the Middle East and North Korea in Asia, trying to upset the balance of power, both trying to become nuclear weapon states. Well, North Korea already is. North Korea has nuclear devices, as Bill Richardson said last night. North Korea, by the way, is now run, due to the death of Kim Jong-il, by a previously unemployed 28-year-old who had no known management responsibilities or political responsibilities. He now owns a nuclear weapons force. And for lack of a better way, and this is somewhat irreverent, but a lack of a better way to describe it, this is a mafia gangster family that's run this country for its own purposes since 1950, North Korea. And this is a country that has cheated on all of its obligations to President Clinton in the agreed framework of 1994, one agreement that we made with them. They lied to President Clinton. They lied to Madeleine Albright when she went there in 1998 or 1999. And they lied to the Bush administration. I worked for both those administrations. When my friend Chris Hill, a really fine American diplomat, a New Englander from Rhode Island, he made an agreement with them that they would back away from this nuclear weapons future, and they violated that. They live next door to China. They're, in a sense, protected by China. You can imagine the complexities and layers of what it's like to figure out a strategy to deal with North Korea. And think about Iran. And we've begun to talk about Iran. Colonel Wilkerson mentioned it. Iran's a very, very difficult state to contend with. They're the leading sponsor of terrorism in the Middle East, funder of terrorism. They have been a real thorn in our sides in both Afghanistan and Iraq. In fact, they supply the IED technology and the money and the political momentum to the Shia militant groups that attacked the American soldiers and are responsible for a lot of the roadside bomb attacks in Iraq and the maiming and wounding and killing of American soldiers. And now they are seeking, and no one around the world doubts this, a nuclear weapons capability. They want to do it. They are on the road to do it. It's a highly irresponsible government. It's a mendacious government. I would even say, in many ways, evil government. And the question for us is, do we use military force to slow them down? Does Israel use military force? Because there's no military solution to this. Or do we try to contain them long term, assume they'll get a nuclear weapon, and try to cope with the aftermath? There aren't a lot of good answers here if you're the President of the United States. So think of Great Recession. Think of the two wars. Think of Iran and North Korea. Think of the Arab awakening. Camden Conference is going to focus on it next year. I don't know where the Arab states will be a year from today. I remember a year ago today, and I remember just as a citizen watching it, feeling so inspired by those young people in Tahrir Square and by the young revolutionaries in Tunisia and in Bahrain and Pearl Square and in Libya. And now think of the present realities, an Egyptian government about to be taken over through the democratic process through elections by a combination of the Muslim Brotherhood and perhaps Salafist parties, a looming collision between those two political parties and the Egyptian military, which may or may not give up real power to them, a reduced quality of life and reduced economic activity for most Egyptians, and I think crushed hopes on the part of most of those young people that Egypt could become, might become, a democratic state. And now look at Syria. A civil war happening, a government firing artillery shells at its citizens, shooting them, has killed 5,000 to 6,000 people in the last 4 or 5 months alone in brutal, brutal warfare, block by block, in places like Hama and Homs in Syria. This is really complicated stuff. And it's difficult for the president to react, as we talked about last night with Bill Richardson. What do? Are we Jefferson's empire of liberty? Do we support every Democrat in every situation? Or are we a combination of that, but also looking at our concrete interests? We need oil and gas. At least, there he is, at least for the next decade or so. We have allies in the Gulf that, in essence, are protecting us forming a bulwark with us against Iran. There are no easy answers here. And that's the thing about the inbox that President Obama has reflected on midway through his first year in office. He said, the thing about my inbox is that it's the most complicated and dangerous inbox because if these problems were simple, somebody below me in this vast government would have resolved it. It wouldn't have come to my inbox. I get the impossible problems, like the Great Recession and the two wars and Iran and North Korea and the Arab revolutions, the Arab awakening. Beyond that, the Euro debt crisis, which, I don't think receives the attention from our serious press that it deserves. Europe matters to us. And in a time when we're talking about, I think correctly, we need to pivot our strategic attention to the East. That's what President Obama said in Canberra in mid-November. That's correct. We have been overly focused on the Middle East, overly committed and insufficiently focused on the real problem, the rise of China. But still, Europe matters. Europe's our largest trade partner. Europe's the largest investor in our economy. The greatest collection of American allies in the world, allies, treaty allies, countries willing to defend us, are our 27 European allies in NATO, and of course our great, great ally, Canada, in the NATO alliance. I was ambassador to NATO, working with Beth, she was in Washington, on 9/11, and I got a call at around 9 p.m. on the 11th of September from my Canadian colleague, David Wright. He was the Dean of Diplomatic Corps at NATO. He said, shouldn't we invoke Article 5? For those of you who may not know what Article 5 is, of the NATO Treaty of April 4th, 1949, it's the key article that says if one of us is attacked, all of us are attacked. If one of us needs help, all of us will help. And it was an amazing moment when we reflected on the horrible carnage of that day, on the collapse of the Twin Towers and all the people dead in New York, and the attack on the Pentagon, and whether, we don't know where Flight 93 was headed, but probably towards the Capitol or White House, to have the NATO alliance arise en masse in one day, and by the next morning invoke Article 5, and to have Le Monde, a French newspaper, write, we are all Americans. And Libby and I, a couple days later, went to Leuven, this beautiful old medieval town in Belgium. Louvain is the French name. And we saw a long line of people outside the beautiful medieval town hall. We wondered what they were lining up for. They were lining up to sign the condolence book. To us, because of what had happened. And when I see some of our presidential candidates, not being partisan, who make fun of the French, it's the proverbial thing in America, and criticize Europe and criticize the European way of life. Boy, were they there for us on 9/11. And you look around this world, 193 nation states, the people we are closest to in terms of values, who we are, our belief in democracy, are the NATO allies. And so, what happens in this Euro debt crisis really matters to us. There are two issues here. Will Greece default? I fear it will. Shortly, within a matter of weeks or months, what will that do to the European Union's fabric, the Eurozone's fabric? Can they sustain a Greek default and not allow the infection to spread to Italy and Spain and Portugal and Ireland and lead to a collapse of the Eurozone, which is the worst case analysis? Existentially, on another level, this is all about whether this great European project, stemming 500 years of war, peace between Germany and France, whether that can continue. There's a lot at stake, and that's another issue that President Obama needs to worry about. Here's another one on top of all these issues that I've mentioned, and there have been tangential references to it today. Cyber crime against us. Cyber invasions of our laptops, criminal groups stealing all of our personal information, our financial information, whatever you have on your laptop. The possibility of cyber terrorism, cyber espionage. The Pentagon's formed a cyber command. It's now a fifth element of warfare that we need to think about. So think about Great Recession and the two wars and Iran and North Korea and the Arab awakening and the Euro debt crisis and the cyber crimes, and I haven't even gotten to the heart of the challenges we face. Because as Bill Richardson said last night, the heart of the next 50 years or so will be the transnational challenges. What are they? The challenges that go under our borders, over our borders, and right through them, like global climate change, and trafficking of women and children. It's a scourge on every continent of the world. Millions of women being trafficked for profit right under our eyes. In places like Boston, Massachusetts, where we live, other parts of this country, all around the world. Think of drug cartels, international, linked, crime cartels. Think of the threat of pandemics, the World Bank predicting global food shortages. Think of the really frightening connection between terrorist groups of whatever stripe, religion, and ideology, it doesn't really matter, and weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and nuclear suitcase technology. What happened on 9/11? Al-Qaeda used the most conventional, crude means available. They flew airplanes into buildings. And it was the resulting fire, the explosion, the fire, the falling buildings that killed the people in the Pentagon and the Twin Towers. If they had had biological or chemical or nuclear suitcase technology, God forbid, on 9/11, multiples of 3,000 people would have been killed in lower Manhattan or in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon. Think of the 21st century power of small groups of people to kill millions of people through technology. So these transnational problems are really forbidding because they tell Americans especially something very profound. We can't go it alone in the world, and we have to create a world, a web of international relationships, talking about grand strategy, to defeat them and to take advantage of the larger, more positive opportunities that we have in an age of great scientific, medical, and technological breakthroughs. So that's the inbox that President Obama, like President George W. Bush before him, faces every day. And it doesn't lend itself to easy analysis, to black or white analysis. It lends itself to cool, rational, painstaking thought, and it lends itself to strategy, which is why I so much admire the work that our two military colleagues have done. So let me conclude, having given you a sense of what we face, with a couple of thoughts that might begin to weave together a sense of strategy from this conference, but also just from the work that all of us have done in government. First, we have to think, as Bill Richardson said last night, about organizing a group of countries, the great powers of the world in the 21st century, to combat the dark side of globalization, as Tom Friedman has called it, and to take advantage of the bright side of globalization, and to do great things, positive things in the world. The group of countries we're normally accustomed to working to are the victorious powers of the Second World War, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council that Bill talked about last night. Some of them very much waning in power, most of our European allies, unfortunately. Russia certainly waning in power. The China of Chiang Kai-shek of 1945 is a very different China of Hu Jintao in 2012. And the problem with our strategic structure in the world, it is outmoded. As I think Puck said today, it's the old world. And so the Security Council needs India on it. And it needs Japan, the second largest funder in the UN system. It certainly needs an African country. The entire continent is unrepresented in the Supreme Council of International Political Power, the Security Council. It needs Brazil, the strongest country in South America and our great partner in the Western Hemisphere. The IMF and the World Bank need to be modernized in terms of their leadership. And we, as the chairman of the board, have to have the self-confidence and strategic foresight to say, let's invite some of these new powers to join us, give them responsibility, ask them to do more. And I say that because so many people want to turn China into a 2012 reincarnation of the Stalinist or Maoist threat of 60 years ago. Hard to do that when China's our largest creditor. Hard to do that when we have a symbiotic economic relationship. We're their largest export market. They need us, and we certainly need them. And so therefore, we don't have an option of containing China the way George Kennan thought about it. We need to engage China, India, Brazil, those 3 especially, and say, join us on the global governing board of the world and help us on our next peacekeeping mission. So it's not just American soldiers doing the work, or the next HIV/AIDS prevention program, which Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has done such great work on that, an American foundation. Can we begin to get some ownership by these rising powers so that we have collective action for the 21st century? The chairman needs to be confident enough to invite these new members onto the board. And that's not exactly the way our political leaders are seeing it. That's step one. Step two, it's all about the economy. And I think we've heard that on every panel yesterday and today, that American national power rests on our private sector and the health of the private sector and the innovative capacity and prosperity of it. And we in Washington, we had some great debates this morning, need to give the proper incentives to the productive, manufacturing, innovative class of our society to bring us back to prosperity. That's step two. Step three, you won't be surprised to hear me say this. We need to return to diplomacy. And we need to think about international politics in the following way. For most of our history, our diplomats have been on point. They've been the primary way we've interfaced with the rest of the world. We asked questions first, and we shot later if we absolutely had to, and the military was always in reserve. And for a lot of reasons, and I'm not saying they were bad reasons, and I understand them psychologically, and I probably was part of this, after 9/11, we were furious. We were shocked to be attacked. The symbol of our economic power, Lower Manhattan, Wall Street, the Twin Towers, the symbol of our military power, the Pentagon, we got into a defensive crouch, and we came out fighting. And we invaded Afghanistan 3.5 weeks later, and I agreed with that decision, and I still agree with it. And then we invaded Iraq, and that's a more debatable proposition, and we can talk about that. And we've got 3 military officers who are experts on it in the Q&A session. But we came out swinging, and we presented the rest of the world with a Marshall America. And not only did we invade 2 countries, take down 2 governments, and occupy 2 capitals, we engaged in long-term military occupations of a type we had never done before in our history, and it's difficult to do. And I want to say one thing in making this point. I admire the way the military acted and acquitted themselves through these long-term occupations. I believe that we, and I include myself in this because I supported both interventions, we, the civilian leaders, did not have the foresight to understand that they could not be 8 and 10 years long. Because it doesn't work in the 21st century. People don't want to be told what to do. And they don't want their cities to be occupied by other people, soldiers, if they can possibly avoid it. It has to be a return to diplomacy. We need the military to be the ultimate line of defense of the country, to protect us. And that's why we need a healthy defense budget and a modernization of that budget. But the diplomats are there to listen, to be our analysts, sometimes to compromise, to make deals, to negotiate, to try to talk to difficult people like Hugo Chavez or Robert Mugabe or the Iranian leadership. Not to say, as so many of our political leaders say, we won't talk to them because they're different or they're evil or we don't agree with them. Yitzhak Rabin, who was about as hard-nosed as anybody, late Israeli prime minister, said, you don't negotiate with your best friends. You negotiate with your enemies, was the word he used. And yet we haven't talked to the Iranians in 32 years. Not a sustained, serious conversation since Jimmy Carter's administration. And yet it's the country we're most likely to go to war with. And yet we've never had a serious talk about whether or not there's a diplomatic solution that might prevent war. So when I say return to diplomacy, we need to believe that diplomacy is real, it can be effective, it's a national asset. So often I hear, oh, it's soft, it's weak, it's not martial. And with the greatest respect, I have a nephew whom I love, Marine Corps officer, 3 combat tours. I admire my military brethren. We couldn't have a better example of a military leader than Grog Johnson. We are too much enthralled in the military. And maybe the military would be the first to say that. We don't believe that we can outsmart our enemies. At the negotiating table, we believe we must outmuscle them. And we can't abuse the military by keeping them constantly in combat. We've got to think that our national power has a diplomatic dimension, and it does. But think what we've done since 9/11. We've fully funded the military. I agree with that. We have fully funded the intelligence community. I agree with that too, as another great national asset of our country. We created the Department of Homeland Security, now the second largest agency in the government. We fully funded it, and we have stripped the State Department of funds. And we've made it difficult for the State Department to do its business because, we don't have warships and we don't have military bases in congressional districts. And it's not really understood that sometimes you have to negotiate with difficult people or compromise with them. That's part of what diplomacy is all about. I say we need to return to diplomacy. Fourth, we need to reject the twin evils of American foreign policy, the twin recipes for failure, and they are isolationism and unilateralism, and we've been too much enthralled to both of them. We tried unilateralism for a while between 2001 and 2005 or so, and it did not work well for us when we essentially said, you're with us or against us, it's my way or the highway. If that's the message to the rest of the world, it's not exactly a winning message. And we've tried isolationism really since the founding of the Republic. Think Jefferson and Hamilton's debates. Think Teddy Roosevelt saying we're going to become a great empire. And President Charles W. Eliot of Harvard saying that's not who we are. We're going to take over the Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico, become an empire. Think of Lindbergh, the most popular American of the 30s, the great isolationist. And thank God we had Franklin Roosevelt to understand we had to be internationalist against Hitler and Tojo. Think of Madeleine Albright going up to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee with Chairman Jesse Helms, and he essentially said we're going to cut U.S. dues to the UN in half in 1997. The founding country, us. The host country, spurning the United Nations. This isolationist streak is powerful. It's in the Tea Party, and I'm an equal opportunity critic. It's in the left wing of the Democratic Party as well in our country. And if we think that we can succeed in an integrated, globalized world by being either unilateralist or isolationist, we will be sorely disappointed. And so we have to lead. Finally, and I'll finish on this point, we have to stand for something, and we have to have a supreme strategic objective. And I believe it should be peace. And the reason I say that is because everything else below peace is merely tactical, means to an end. We have to have a supreme goal that's bigger than just defending ourselves. Barriers, protect. These are the words we've used really since 9/11 as we talk to each other. As our political leaders in both parties talk to us, they say, vote for me, I'll defend you, I'll protect you. I'll create a department to defend. We'll set up elaborate procedures at airports to defend you. All good stuff. I'm not criticizing it. We have to stand for something as a democratic society that's beyond just self-interest, protecting ourselves. And it's interesting to reflect upon political rhetoric. I grew up outside of Boston, Mass, and Wellesley, Mass. As a little kid in the 1960s, as a high school student in the 1970s, I remember leaders of both parties saying, vote for me, I stand for peace. John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Richard M. Nixon, Nelson Rockefeller, people who ran for president in those years, said, vote for me because I'll bring you peace. What do all of our politicians now say when they run for the highest office in the land? Vote for me, I'll defend you. That is important. But there's something above defense, and that is seeking peace. And I'm not talking in a woolly, overly idealistic way about a perfect state of peace among men and women and nature, that people will never fight each other or get angry with each other. That's unrealistic. But President Kennedy said, in the greatest speech he ever gave, the American University graduation address in June 1963, when he'd gone through the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Berlin Crisis, and he'd seen the abyss of nuclear war, he gave a speech where he said, we have to believe in peace. We have to talk to the Soviet Union. We have to compromise. We have to have a sense of restraint as we act in the world. We can't fight everybody. And peace, he said, not a peace enforced by American weapons of war, not a Pax Americana, but a peace that makes life on earth worth living. And we Americans, as the greatest democratic country on earth, must stand for peace. We may never realize it. We may never get there. But if that's not the supreme objective of all of our efforts internationally, I think we lower our ambitions and we're not true to the great democratic values of our country and our founding fathers and mothers. So that's what I wanted to say to you all today.